Glenn Beck wrote an article this morning, the article was published this morning, and the title of the article was Empathy for Black Lives Matter. And the article was received well by a lot of people. Van Jones of CNN spoke positively of it. Sean King, who's been a guest on the show, spoke positively of it, and very candidly, but positively about this pivot in Glenn Beck. The premise of the article simply is that he has placed himself in the shoes. He empathizes with, right? Not sympathizes, but he has empathy with Black Lives Matter. And it's funny that they use Black Lives Matter in the headline, because that's not quite really what he said in the article. And we'll discuss that in a moment. But he has empathy with Black lives, but not necessarily the banner of Black Lives Matter. And I'll unpack that inside of as we discuss some of the key quotes that I'm going to pull out of here. But the first thing that comes to mind with Glenn Beck, though, is that Glenn Beck is one of the people who's most responsible for the environment that we have, the climate, the political climate, and the animus between African Americans and America, and the racial tensions and the treatment of President Obama and us seeing over the last years this putrid attack against President Obama that on most occasions was not a substantive attack from the right. It was simply that President Obama was their enemy, and they would use any means, including racial dog whistles, to attack President Obama. At the forefront, at the tip of the spear of that attack, were the conservative hosts, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and Glenn Beck. So, for him to shift and say that he has empathy with Black lives seems on the surface to be like, wow, this is a pivotal moment. This is an amazing thing. But of course, there's a problem with it. So he starts off in this article discussing what brought him to this flashpoint of something's wrong and something needs to change. And I'm going to read a direct quote. He says, "I made what I thought was a relatively uncontroversial point about the commonalities between Trump supporters and Black Lives Matter activists. I thought this was a simple idea, but the criticism was immediate and sharp. How dare you try to understand the quote unquote other side?" So he was giving a speech in front of a bunch of conservatives, and he tried to draw a parallel between Black Lives Matter and Donald Trump supporters. And he immediately got a backlash from conservatives who let him have it. I mean, you could just Google and look online at the type of responses he got by trying to draw some commonalities between Donald Trump supporters who felt left out, who felt angry about the system and the way that America is treating them, and Black Lives Matter, who feel that the system is unjustly treating them. But making that comparison made him almost the enemy of conservatism. And he was taken aback like, I don't understand. This should not be a controversial statement. Well, Glenn, one of the reasons this simple act of trying to draw a comparison, this simple act of trying to find common ground, one of the reasons it is so problematic for conservatives to even receive that is because for the last 8 years, you've made a fortune. You and Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh have made fortunes out of driving a wedge between Americans, driving a wedge between Black Americans and your conservative following vis-a-vis President Obama. You've made a fortune off of this division, and now you're surprised that it's coming back to bite you in the ass? See, you may have found religion, but all of those millions of people that you led into the arms of bigotry, they haven't found it yet. Anyways, another quote I want to read. this is the comparison he tried to draw. He said, in their own ways, this is Glenn Beck. He said, in their own ways, they're saying I'm not being heard, of Donald Trump supporters, of Black Lives Matter, of the Tea Party, of the Occupy Wall Street. He lumps them all together and says that in their own ways, they're simply saying, I am not being heard. I don't feel like I belong anymore. I have no control over my future. I'm not placing all of these movements on the same footing in terms of my personal position, nor am I suggesting that because I find them to be analogous, they are equal, but there are, in my opinion, some strong commonalities, both good and bad. So in other words, he's saying, don't mistake, he's hedging right here, right? Saying, I don't want you guys to actually think I identify with Occupy Wall Street, and don't think I actually identify with Black Lives Matter, but for the sake of a rhetorical conversation, right? A rhetorical device, I want to draw some comparisons between the two. So he clearly understands that if he slips up for 1 second and makes it appear as though he identifies with them, that this would be a problem for him. The reason he understands that is because he has taken the last 8 years to make a fortune out of that division. But the point that he was trying to make is that, and this part I actually agree with him in, is inside of every single movement, whether we agree with them or not, inside of every single movement, there are three people. There are three types of people: the believers, the political insiders, and the instigators. And he's saying that in his time, he found that in the Tea Party, there were believers, there were political insiders, and there were instigators, right? And that inside of Black Lives Matter, they're believers, they're political insiders, and they're instigators, people who can, the political insiders are the people who can leverage it for their own personal benefit, right? The instigators would be the anarchists who showed up to the Bernie Sanders protest at the DNC, the people who, and then you have the genuine believers, right? That's a pretty reasonable estimation there. Okay, I was about to let him have it again there because, well, what the hell? You, Glenn, you were the political insider who was able to feign as though you were a believer. That's why you were so successful for the Tea Party, because you were the televangelist. You were the Rod Parsley. You were the Jimmy Swaggart of the Tea Party movement, because you were able to get online and make it seem as though you were the conservative and you understand so passionately about the problems that conservatives face in this dying America, this cesspool of moral decay that America is. You were able to make a fortune off of being that faux believer. I mean, whether you believed it or not is kind of besides the point, because you monetized that belief. And millions of people followed you as you drove this wedge between conservatism and the Black community, specifically through President Obama. And then here's the next quote. He said, I also saw a lot of hate online. People were shocked that the Blaze portrayed grieving parents, and he's speaking of the parents of the parents of the gunman from Dallas who he interviewed. Someone on his platform, the Blaze, interviewed them. And in that interview of the gunman in Dallas, I believe Micah Xavier, I forgot his last name. The Blaze had his parents on an interview. And in that interview, they displayed these parents and portrayed these parents to be human, who were hurting. And they were hurting for their son as well as the people he killed. And because he showed this humanity on his platform, The Blaze, he got a rabid backlash from his followers. So he takes his time in this article to make the case that there are a lot of really negative people on the right who don't want to even take a moment to identify with human suffering, no matter whether you agree with their politics or not. We're all human, and can't we all just get along and see and have empathy for each other? But he neglects to mention how much money he has made being the person who perpetuates that hatred online. And this is the part that bothers me the most about the article. And I get it. Listen, I appreciate that he's thinking about making a good transition. Congratulations, right? Let me not be disingenuous. Let me applaud him. Congratulations. You're thinking about becoming a better person. Okay. And I appreciate the olive branch. I do. But there's some problems, right? There's some things that we have to address that if we don't address them first, then I can't really hear what you have to say, because to me, it's another opportunity to usher yourself back into the limelight. But this is what he said about the massacre in Dallas. He said, after the massacre, I invited several Black Lives Matter believers on my show. I got to know them as people on and off air and invited them back again. These individuals are decent, hardworking, patriotic Americans, and we don't agree on everything, certainly not on politics. But are we not more than politics? Watch this. I refuse to define each of them based on the worst among them. No movement is monolithic. The individuals I met that day are not Black Lives Matter. They are Black Americans who feel disenfranchised, aggrieved. They are believers. They are my neighbors and my fellow citizens. Oh man, Glenn, that sounds, man. That's some good shit right there, Glenn Beck. I mean, I gotta applaud you again on that, because that's really heartwarming. Here's the problem. If we have to wait for all of the people that you led down this path towards animus, towards the Black community, renewed, right? It's not as though you created it. So I'm not going to place that at your feet, but you helped renew it and you helped monetize it through your platform and through the Blaze. And you have led them down this path. So if we now have to wait for every one of those millions of people to have this personal experience with Black people, to sit down and have dinner with us and realize, man, they're not thugs. They're just good patriotic Americans. If we have to wait for everyone that you brainwash to have this come to Jesus moment, then we will never see justice in America. We will never see empathy in America. Forget justice. We will never see empathy. We will never see it because it is so profitable for people like Glenn Beck, theblaze.com, and his newest henchwoman, Tommy Lauren. It is a profitable industry, and they have led millions upon millions of people to just become the most rabid, vitriolic, hate-filled individuals. I'll stop there. So, if you really have empathy with the Black community, with Black lives, or people who are believers in Black Lives Matter, you got to do more than just write this article. You have to. You have to, because you as an individual, Glenn Beck, have been responsible for leading millions of people to a place that you can't even recognize anymore. You've taken them so far that they can't even hear a conciliatory message from you. It's like my dad always said, you can feed an alligator all you want. You can feed people to the alligator all you want. You'll just be the last one that it eats. And for the last 8 years, Glenn Beck has been feeding the Black community, President Obama, Black issues, justice. He's been feeding it to his audience. He's just been feeding it to them because they thrived on it. And now all of a sudden he's saying, but I want to be conciliatory. I want to have empathy. And they're saying, no, Glenn Beck, kiss our white asses. We're believers. So unless you can undo that, unless you are willing to address that, then you can have all the empathy you want. It absolutely means nothing because of all the people you led down a path that you can't even bring them back from.